The title of this probably doesn't seem terribly interesting or exciting to you. Political economy sounds like one of those big, thick, boring books that you have to look at in the library, but even if you don't want to. But laissez-faire, meaning let it be. Just leave things alone and let things do what they want to do. Laissez-faire politics plays a big part in Victorian England. Laissez-faire capitalism was basically an economic policy that said, let the market work it out for itself. It comes from French. In French, laissez-faire means something like let it be or leave it alone. Just leave it as it is. And in the economic context, it's basically about letting the market sort itself out without the government interfering. If people want to pay that price, they can pay that price. If people want to pay more, they can pay more. People, let the market sort itself out. Just leave it alone. An extreme example would be that in early 19th century England, there was no control over prostitution. If people wanted to buy women, they would pay the price. If women wanted to sell their bodies, they would sell at the price they wanted to. Let them do what they want, basically. Laissez-faire, especially if it's connected with money. Anything you want to sell, you can sell it. Anything you want to buy, you can buy it. Ahing sing so? Anybody? Okay, the Opium Wars, another shameful aspect of the British Empire. We want to sell opium. Well, we're Chinese. We don't want your opium. Could you just not come and, leave us alone? And no, you have to open your markets to us. Okay? If the market wants it, if people are going to buy it, people should be able to sell it. So the British government was fighting in China for the right to sell opium, for example. So it's connected with this whole idea of free enterprise, that people can develop their businesses without having lots of conditions imposed upon them. You still get this idea coming up today. Margaret Thatcher was basically interested in laissez-faire policies. Let the market decide. Often shakai shugi, socialism, is connected with the opposite, that laissez-faire is a conservative thing and socialism is the opposite to laissez-faire. Socialism is about control of the markets, but it's not as simple as that, because, for example, we could look at China. It's a communist country. It's strong. It's not just shakai shugi, it's kyosan shugi, which is stronger than socialism. But it's a communist country that has basically a laissez-faire economic policy for the last 30 years or so. So it's not quite as simple as left-wing and right-wing, but we usually think of laissez-faire as connected with the right-wing conservative way of thinking. But rather than thinking that laissez-faire is the opposite of socialism, it might be better to think that interventionism and laissez-faire. Intervention is coming and saying, no, we need to control this. We have to control this. Controlling it, the government wants to control it. The government, for example, in Japan, the government says, we like the Japanese countryside to have rice fields, tambo. But if we leave it to the market, those tambo are not economic. The government has to control the economy so that you people in Japan pay much more than you should for your rice, okay? And control imports of rice so that it still makes economic sense for the Japanese farmers to grow rice. If the Japanese government didn't control it, you would get filled in with rice from Thailand, from China, from everywhere around the world, because it would be much, 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 much cheaper. Okay, so the government controls it. That's interventionism, control by the government to sort of to protect a market. In this case, to protect Japanese rice. Okay, so you've got interventionism on the one hand, and you've got laissez-faire on the other. So Victorian England is often considered to be a sort of laissez-faire situation. Reality is more complicated than that. There was a kind of mixture of both types of policies throughout the period. Actually, towards the end of the 19th century, more intervention came in. It's very complicated. One example that I think you'll find interesting is the 1840s, when there was a food crisis, particularly in Ireland. A famine is when people die because there's not enough food. So I'd like to look at the situation in Ireland. I have hinted before that Ireland was particularly badly treated, by Britain, and it may be worse than any of the other colonies. Ireland had the worst experience. And you can see it through the potato famine, which incidentally I did not learn about when I was a schoolboy. They didn't want to teach me this stuff. The Hungry Forties, the potato famine. I think it's important to understand that while the British Empire was growing, while the Industrial Revolution was going on in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, many people were hungry. Working all day in a factory and still not getting enough food to eat. Food was a problem. Poor people were pushed off the land, as we studied, in the late part of the 18th century and forced into cities. And then the question is, how are they going to be fed? Up until 1846, there was interventionism. There were laws that were controlling the food economy. And those laws were mostly to protect the rich landowners. So the rich would get richer and the poor people would go hungry. And food was expensive. So particularly corn for making bread, prices were artificially high, just like the price for rice in Japan, except that in Japan, very few people are actually going hungry from day to day. In Victorian England, and well, before Queen Victoria and the earlier part of the century, the 19th century, quite a lot of people were going hungry. And, of course, consumer spending was going down because people had to spend a lot of their money on food. There wasn't enough money left over for other things. So buying a new pair of shoes, hey, the shoes would fall off people's feet. Children especially would be going around with no shoes because the money for new shoes just wasn't there. The money was going on food. So not good for the Industrial Revolution economy. People have to buy goods. So in the end, this system changed. In the 1840s, these food shortages became much worse. The Hungry Forties were the worst that had been experienced for a very long time. And in Ireland, it was much, much worse again. You see, for most Irish people, the potato was the basic food stuff. For most Irish people, they would be eating potatoes several times a day. It was their basic food. Just like you have asa gohan, hiru gohan, and bang gohan, they had asa potato, potato and bang potato. Okay, that was what they had. Okay, and when the potato crop failed, hundreds of thousands, even roughly getting close to 1 million people died. And as a result of the potato famine, 2 million people left Ireland and never went back, many of them going to America, in addition to the million who died. The population of Ireland today is still less than it was before the potato famine. The population never got back to the same level. So the potato famine had a huge, huge effect on Ireland. So around 8 million people were living in Ireland before the famine. And these days it's about 6.5 million. Never got back to the level before the famine. Irish history, I think I'll go through this fairly quickly because we have looked at the history of Ireland. Maybe I shouldn't go into this too much, and because we don't have time. English control had begun in the 12th century. English controlled Ireland by the end of the 16th century. They controlled most of the country. It was a Catholic country, and of course Britain was Protestant, so there was a lot of sabitsu, a lot of prejudice against the Irish. And England had followed a policy of encouraging British Protestants to settle in Ireland. All of this we've talked about before on the course. And some of the settlers were English and others were Scottish, especially in the north of Ireland. All of this we've talked about, so I don't want to hang around too much. Let's move on quickly. Basically what it means is that the Catholics in Ireland are getting more and more under the control of the Protestants. And we talked about how they didn't have rights during the 18th century. We talked about how they couldn't become school teachers. They were not allowed to get an education outside the country. They couldn't buy an expensive horse. And we talked about this kind of thing. And they were treated a little better than animals at that time. And Jonathan Swift's modest proposal suggesting that we might as well eat Irish babies. Well, that's something else that I mentioned earlier on in the course. Okay, all of these things, I'm just reminding you, we talked about them before. Okay? Okay. All right. Those are just some of the things that were done to the Irish at that time. And this was a period called the Protestant Ascendancy. It lasted from 1691 to 1801. You remember that Ireland became part of the United Kingdom at this time, 1801. And tens or hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics were shipped off to America as, well, there's some dispute, were they slaves or were they indentured servants, which is one step up from slaves. There's a kind of debate about it, but effectively they were discriminated against very badly. They were used as laborers and they had a very bad life. Here you can see an Irish woman from an early 19th century photograph. See how she's barefoot, how she's getting water from a little puddle here. Just the whole look of her. She looks like, well, I don't know. You think that it was supposed to be a civilized country, wasn't it, Britain? And its neighbour, Ireland, people were living like this. Along comes the potato famine. And the famine can be seen largely as a consequence of laissez-faire politics, the free market, because the government was influenced by two very important works from the 18th century. One of them was by Malthus, and it was called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And what he's basically saying is that population goes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. It increases exponentially. Whereas food goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It increases mathematically. So food production can never keep up with population growth. So Malthus's theory was, we just have to let people die. We can't feed them all, because food production only increases like that. We can't feed this huge increase in population. We just have to let people die. Okay, so you get something like the Irish potato famine, and people are saying, that's the world, that's nature. You just have to let people die. That's nature's way of keeping the balance. And the other was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is the kind of original book of economics, which we're still using. People still look at Adam Smith for economic teaching, and the idea that the markets have to be left to take their own course in regulating the economy. And there's still a big debate about whether the government was actually wazato, intentionally leaving the Irish people to starve. But some people say yes, some people say no. But one thing's for sure, they did not really help. Not enough help was given, and in fact, food was being taken out of Ireland at the same time as people were dying because they had no food. The government wouldn't send large shipments of food into Ireland, and the idea was that that was going to disrupt the local economy and local producers wouldn't be able to sell their goods. And on the other hand, it didn't prevent food from being sent out of Ireland. The argument was that local producers had a right to sell their goods wherever they could make most profit. So not enough food was going into Ireland, and food was actually being sold out of Ireland because people out of Ireland could pay a better price. So the fresh fruit, the vegetables, the products were being sent away to feed people in England while people in Ireland were dying. Simple historical fact. Well, you're saved by the bell. I'm sorry my timing wasn't too good. I spent too much time on the first presentation. We'll leave this one here and we'll perhaps finish it off next week. I'm still waiting for your emails, many of you, about your term paper. Okay? So please, if you haven't sent me an email, please send me one. Okay then, we'll finish there.